Imagine you are standing in the middle of a frozen wasteland, surrounded by nothing but endless snow and ice, where the temperature drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the wind howls like 1,000 screaming souls. Now, imagine finding 9 bodies scattered across this desolate landscape, some half naked, some with missing eyes, one with a missing tongue, and all of them bearing injuries so severe that investigators would later say they look like victims of a car crash, not a hiking trip. This is not a horror movie. This is not fiction. This is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, one of the most disturbing and unexplained mysteries in human history. On the night of February 1st, 1959, 9 experienced hikers died under circumstances so bizarre that even after more than 6 decades, nobody can explain what really happened on that cursed mountain. The Soviet government classified the case, witnesses were silenced, and the official reports contained details so shocking that they were hidden from the public for years. What could make 9 experienced mountaineers cut their way out of their tent from the inside in the middle of a freezing night and run barefoot into a blizzard? What force was so terrifying that they chose to face certain death in the frozen wilderness rather than stay in the safety of their shelter? Was it an avalanche, a military experiment gone wrong, or something far more sinister? Before we dive into this chilling mystery, let me tell you this. After you hear what happened on that mountain, you will never look at the wilderness the same way again. Our story begins in late January 1959, when a group of 10 hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute assembled in the city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, in the Soviet Union. These were not amateur adventurers or reckless thrill seekers. They were some of the most experienced hikers and skiers in the region, all of them holding at least grade 2 certification in hiking and mountaineering, which was the second highest certification in the Soviet Union at that time. The leader of the expedition was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a fifth-year engineering student who was known for his meticulous planning and leadership skills. The group included 8 men and 2 women: Yuri Yudin, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Alexander Kolovatov, Alexander Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, and Lyudmila Dubinina. Their goal was to reach Ototen, a mountain in the northern Ural range, a journey that would cover more than 300 kilometers and earn them a grade 3 certification, the highest distinction in Soviet mountaineering. They were well prepared, well equipped, and highly motivated. On January 27th, they depart from Sverdlovsk by train, then by truck, and finally on skis, moving steadily through the frozen landscape. But here's the first strange detail. On January 28th, one member of the group, Yuri Yudin, fell ill and had to turn back. He would be the only survivor, not because he was lucky, but because he was not there when whatever happened on that mountain took place. Yudin later said that parting with his friends that day saved his life, but it also condemned him to a lifetime of guilt and unanswered questions. What did he miss? What horror unfolded after he left? Keep that question in your mind, because as we go deeper into this story, you will realize that sometimes not knowing is even more terrifying than knowing. The group continued their journey, and according to their diaries and photographs found later, everything seemed normal. They were in high spirits, laughing, singing songs, and documenting their journey with a camera. On January 31st, they reached the edge of a highland area and prepared for the final and most difficult part of their trek. The plan was to cross a mountain pass and set up a base camp on the other side, but because of worsening weather conditions and heavy snowfall, they lost their direction. Instead of moving south toward the pass, they veered too far to the west and found themselves on the slopes of a mountain called Kolatsiakhl, which in the language of the indigenous Mansi people means dead mountain. Even the name sends chills down your spine, doesn't it? The Mansi people, who had lived in that region for centuries, considered that mountain to be cursed and avoided it at all costs, But the hikers, either unaware or undeterred by the mountain's dark reputation, decided to set up camp there for the night. It was February 1st, 1959, and it would be the last night any of them would spend alive. Now here is where the mystery truly begins. The hikers pitched their tent on the mountain slope, secured it with ropes and poles, and settled in for the night. But something happened that night. Something so horrifying that it made 9 experienced hikers, trained to survive in extreme conditions, cut through their own tent from the inside and run out into the freezing darkness wearing only their underwear and socks. Think about that for a moment. These were not panicked amateurs. These were people who had survived harsh conditions before. People who understood that leaving a tent in sub-zero temperatures without proper clothing meant certain death. Yet they did it anyway. What could possibly be so terrifying that death by freezing seemed like the better option? When the group failed to return as scheduled, a search and rescue operation was launched on February 20th, more than 2 weeks after their last known camp. Volunteer students, police, and military personnel combed the area, and on February 26th, they found the tent. What they discovered there would haunt investigators for decades. The tent was still standing, partially covered in snow, but it had been cut open from the inside. Not torn by wind, not ripped by an animal, but deliberately sliced with a knife by someone trying to get out as quickly as possible. Inside the tent, they found all the hikers' belongings, their shoes, their warm clothes, their food, everything they would need to survive. But the hikers themselves were gone. Footprints led away from the tent down the slope toward a nearby forest. And here is another chilling detail. Some of the footprints were made by bare feet, some by socks, and some by a single boot. The track suggested that the group had left in a hurry, walking in single file, but there were no signs of a struggle, no signs of an attack, no signs of anything that would explain why they abandoned their only shelter. The search team followed the footprints for about 1.5 kilometers until they reached the edge of a forest, and there, under a large cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were found lying near the remains of a small fire, dressed only in their underwear. Their hands were burned, as if they had been desperately trying to keep the fire going, and branches on the cedar tree above them were broken, suggesting that one or both of them had climbed the tree, possibly to get a better view of something, or to escape from something. But what? And why would they climb a tree in the middle of a freezing night instead of returning to the tent where all their warm clothes and supplies were? The bodies showed signs of hypothermia, but there was something else. Something that did not make sense. Krivonishenko's mouth and lips were covered in blood, and pieces of his own flesh were missing, as if he had bitten himself in pain or terror. The investigators pressed on, and 3 more bodies were discovered between the cedar tree and the tent. Rustem Slobodin, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Igor Dyatlov himself were found at intervals along the slope, as if they had been trying to make their way back to the tent but collapsed one by one from exhaustion and cold. Dyatlov's body was found in a position suggesting he had been crawling uphill. Kolmogorova had severe frostbite and tissue damage. Slobodin had a small crack in his skull, but it was not considered fatal. All 3 had died from hypothermia. But the question remained, why did they leave the tent in the first place? The search continued, but the remaining 4 bodies, those of Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Alexander Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, were not found until May, more than 2 months later, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine about 75 meters away from the cedar tree. And this is where the story takes a turn from mysterious to absolutely terrifying. Unlike the first 5 victims who died from hypothermia, the 4 bodies found in the ravine had suffered massive internal injuries. Dubinina had major chest fractures, her ribs were broken, and most horrifying of all, her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips were missing. Zolotaryov also had severe chest fractures, and Thibaut Brignol had a crushed skull. The medical examiner, a man named Boris Vozrojdeny, stated in his report that the force required to cause such injuries was comparable to a high-speed car crash, and he emphasized that these injuries could not have been caused by another human being because the force was simply too great. But here's the most disturbing part. There were no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises on the skin, only internal devastation. It was as if they had been subjected to an immense pressure or blast, something that crushed their bones from the inside without leaving a mark on the outside. Even more bizarre, some of the victims were wearing clothes that belonged to others. Dubinina was wearing Krivonishenko's pants, and part of Zolotaryov's clothing was cut from Dubinina's body. Why would they exchange clothes in the middle of a freezing night? Were the ones who died first stripped by the survivors in a desperate attempt to stay warm? That would make sense, except for one small detail. Some of the clothing was found to be radioactive. Yes, you heard that right. When the clothing was tested, it showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Not enough to kill someone instantly, but enough to raise serious questions. Where did this radiation come from? Was it from a military test? Was it from a natural source? Or was it from something else entirely? The Soviet authorities conducted an investigation, but the findings were vague and unsatisfying. The official conclusion, released in May 1959, stated that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force that they were unable to overcome. That is it. No explanation of what that force was, no details, no accountability. The case was quickly closed, the files were classified, and the area was declared off limits to hikers and adventurers for the next 3 years. But the story did not end there. Over the decades, numerous theories have been proposed to explain what happened on that mountain, and each one is more unsettling than the last. Some believe it was an avalanche. Proponents of this theory argue that the hikers heard the sound of an approaching avalanche, panicked, cut their way out of the tent, and ran to safety. But this theory has several problems. First, the tent was found largely intact and still standing, which would not be the case if an avalanche had hit it. Second, experienced mountaineers would know that running downhill in the path of an avalanche is a death sentence. They would have moved laterally along the slope, not straight down. Third, no signs of an avalanche were found at the site. In 2021, a study published in a scientific journal attempted to revive this theory using modern computer simulations, suggesting that a small, delayed slab avalanche could have caused the injuries and the panic. But even the researchers admitted that this theory does not explain all the evidence, particularly the radiation, the missing soft tissue, and the severe internal injuries without external trauma. Others believe it was a military test gone wrong. In 1959, the Cold War was at its peak, and the Soviet Union was conducting numerous secret experiments in remote areas. Some researchers have pointed out that the area where the hikers died was relatively close to a military installation, and that there were reports of strange lights in the sky on the night of the incident. Several witnesses, including other hikers in the area and residents of nearby villages, reported seeing bright orange spheres floating in the sky around the time of the deaths. Could the hikers have stumbled upon a secret military test involving missiles, chemical weapons, or some kind of experimental technology? Could they have been exposed to a blast or a pressure wave that caused their injuries? This would explain the radiation, the internal trauma, and the government's eagerness to close the case and classify the files. But it does not explain why the hikers would cut their way out of the tent and run in such a panicked state. A military test would likely have been visible or audible from a distance, giving them time to react more rationally. Then there is the theory of infrasound. Infrasound refers to low-frequency sound waves that are below the range of human hearing, but can still affect the human body and mind. In certain weather conditions, wind passing over mountains can create infrasound waves that cause feelings of extreme anxiety, dread, and even hallucinations. Some scientists have suggested that the hikers were exposed to infrasound, which caused them to panic, lose their rationality, and flee into the night in a state of terror. This would explain their irrational behavior, but it does not explain the severe physical injuries, the radiation, or the missing body parts. Another theory involves the indigenous Mansi people. Some have speculated that the hikers accidentally trespassed on sacred Mansi land and were attacked as punishment. However, this theory is widely dismissed because the Mansi were known to be peaceful and had no history of violence against outsiders. Moreover, the injuries sustained by the hikers, particularly the massive internal trauma, could not have been caused by human attackers using primitive weapons. The medical examiner was very clear on this point. The force was simply too great. And then, there are the more fringe theories: aliens, yetis, secret government experiments involving mind control or chemical agents, paranormal phenomena, and even theories involving ball lightning or plasma phenomena. While these theories capture the imagination, they lack credible evidence and are largely considered speculative. But here's the thing: when the rational explanations fail to account for all the evidence, people are left with no choice but to consider the irrational. And that is what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so deeply unsettling. It forces us to confront the limits of our understanding and accept that there are things in this world that we simply cannot explain. In the years since the incident, the families of the victims have fought for answers, and investigators have reopened the case multiple times. In 2019, on the 60th anniversary of the tragedy, the Russian government launched a new investigation and concluded, once again, that an avalanche was the most likely cause. But this conclusion has been met with skepticism by many experts, independent researchers, and the families of the victims, who believe that critical evidence has been ignored or suppressed. The tent, for instance, was never properly preserved or analyzed. The radioactive clothing was never fully explained. The missing eyes and tongue of Lyudmila Dubinina were attributed to natural decomposition by scavengers, but some forensic experts have questioned this, noting that the soft tissue was removed in a way that seemed too clean, too precise. There is also the question of the photographs. The hikers had a camera with them, and several rolls of film were recovered and developed. Most of the photos showed normal scenes of the journey: smiling faces, snowy landscapes, and campfires. But one roll of film, found in the camera belonging to one of the hikers, contained a series of strange, blurry images. Some of these images appear to show lights in the sky, indistinct shapes, and what some claim looks like figures or silhouettes in the distance. The quality is too poor to draw any definite conclusions, but the existence of these photos has fueled speculation for decades. What were they trying to photograph in their final moments? Did they see something that terrified them so much that they felt compelled to document it, even as they were fleeing for their lives? And let us not forget the diary entries. The hikers kept detailed journals of their journey, and the last entry, written on the day they reached the dead mountain, is eerily mundane. It talks about the weather, the terrain, and their plans for the next day. There is no indication of fear, no mention of anything unusual, no sense that anything was wrong. It is as if whatever happened suddenly and without warning, giving them no time to prepare, no time to understand, and no time to survive. But there is one detail in the diaries that has drawn attention. In one of the last entries, the hikers jokingly referred to the area as the Land of the Dead, and even created a fake newspaper as a joke, filled with humorous stories and mock advertisements. One of the fake stories was about a yeti roaming the mountains. Was this just humor? Or did they sense something about the place? Something dark and foreboding that they tried to laugh off to keep their spirits up? Today, the Dyatlov Pass, named after the leader of the ill-fated expedition, remains one of the most haunted and mysterious places on Earth. Every year, adventurous hikers, researchers, and curiosity seekers make the journey to the site, hoping to find answers, or perhaps hoping to experience something that might help them understand what happened on that terrible night. Some claim to have felt an overwhelming sense of dread when approaching the area. Others report equipment malfunctions, strange sounds, and unexplained lights. Whether these experiences are real or simply the result of suggestion and the power of the human imagination, no one can say for sure. What we do know is that 9 young, intelligent, capable people went into the mountains with dreams of adventure and achievement, and none of them came back alive. We know that they died in ways that defy easy explanation, that the official investigations have been inconsistent and incomplete, and that more than 65 years later, we are no closer to understanding the truth than we were in 1959. So, what really happened on Dead Mountain? Was it a natural disaster, a tragic accident compounded by bad luck and poor decisions? Was it a government cover up, a secret military experiment that went horribly wrong and was buried to protect national security? Or was it something else, something beyond our comprehension, something that exists in the shadows of the unknown, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to wander into its grasp? The truth is, we may never know. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Not the deaths themselves, but the fact that despite all our technology, all our science, and all our investigations, there are still mysteries in this world that remain unsolved, questions that remain unanswered, and horrors that remain unexplained. The 9 hikers who died on that mountain took the truth with them into the frozen darkness, and it remains there still, buried under snow, ice, and decades of speculation. Dead Mountain keeps its secrets well, and maybe, just maybe, some secrets are meant to stay buried. If this story sent chills down your spine, if it made you question what lies beyond the boundaries of our understanding, then you are not alone. History is filled with moments that defy explanation, events that shake the very foundation of what we believe to be true. Speaking of such events, there is another story, another moment in history that changed the world forever. A moment when the skies rained fire and the world was plunged into a war that would reshape nations and destinies. I am talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor, a day of infamy that stunned the world and set in motion a chain of events that still echoes in our present. What really happened on that fateful morning of December 7th, 1941? Why was America caught off guard? And were there secrets hidden in the shadows, secrets that some say were deliberately kept from the public? If you want to uncover the truth behind one of the most pivotal moments in human history, check out the next video. Trust me, you will not want to miss it.